Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Bana, who was a early 7th century Sanskrit poet. I am reading his work out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, which has only a very small selection of his poems. I'm also going to give the same disclaimer that I've given in other videos about Sanskrit poets, which is that I am pronouncing this as a reader of this poetry who does not know how Sanskrit names are supposed to sound. So I think it's Bana, some variation thereupon. I'm very possibly wrong. If I am, and you can give me a sort of phonetic pronunciation in the comments, I'd appreciate that. But Bana was a court poet in northern India for King Harsavardhana. Again, I probably am pronouncing that wrong. I apologize if I am. But he was a court poet. And court poets throughout history have been incredibly important and influential literary figures. But Bana seems to have been especially important because according to the brief introduction here in the Norton Anthology, he composed two works that were major turning points in Sanskrit literature. Karita, about his royal patron, the first full-length account of an Indian ruler by a contemporaneous biographer, and Kadambari, maybe, the first work of novelistic fiction in an Indian language written in poetic prose. So this guy was an innovator. He was a unique talent as far as authors go because he changed the game in some ways. Like, he came up with things that people were not doing before him, and that's super, super cool. But he also wrote these short poems, these short imagistic poems called Subhashita. Again, probably pronouncing wrong, but they're these very, very common poetic forms in Sanskrit. It's short poems that are almost impressionistic in that they are meant to capture a very short scene or experience, and they're meant to evoke emotions through vignettes, basically. They're short, evocative descriptions of scenes. And the Norton Anthology has 3 of these from Bana. So the first one, I'm going to read all 3 of them because they're interesting in the striking ways in which they use sensory detail. So that's, I think, a crucial component of these poems. So here's the first one. The horse rises, stretches his hind legs, lengthens his body by lowering his spine, then arches his neck down, his head bent to his chest, and shakes the dust from his mane. His nostrils quiver under the muzzle, sniffing for grass. He whinnies softly as he scrapes the ground with his hoof. So again, there's no plot to them. That's one of the great things, I think, about a lot of Sanskrit poetry is it's not plot driven, but we have action, and that action is evocative. It's meaningful. It tells us something. Like, this is just an image of a horse stretching, looking for food, etc., etc. But we get all of these sort of ideas evoked from the physicality of the horse. So, I mean, like, you can almost see in your mind's eye the power of the horse's body when it stretches, when it moves, when the horse lowers its neck. You can almost see the physicality of this animal. And again, I think there's a great, I've made this comparison in other videos about Sanskrit poetry. I think there's a great comparison to paintings because these Subhashita are so visual. So here's another one. The puff of smoke from the forest fire, black as the shoulder of a young buffalo, curls slightly, spreads, is broken for a moment, falls, then gathers its power gracefully, and rising thick, it slowly lays upon the sky its transient ornaments. So again, it's all about these sort of visual elements, and we get these ideas of movement, the fluidity of nature, the tension between something that's transient or transcendental and something that's more permanent. I mean, we've got the contrast between the solidity of an image like the shoulder of a young buffalo, a very solid, stocky animal that typically represents stability and solidity, versus this smoke that is fluid almost, that moves and shifts and changes. Then we've got this last poem in the Norton Anthology. At evening, having warmed himself to heart's content before the public fire, nor minded how he scorched his rags, he then lies down to sleep on straw within the village shrine, but the wind blows wet with sleet. His shivering soon wakes him, for his half a cloak is old and cold and full of holes. He moans, huddling from one corner to the next. Again, we've got this great impression of this beggar, I think, this person who is seeking shelter in the public shrine, who's living outside in the elements, and whose body is exposed to this suffering, this physical suffering. And I think there's a sort of implicit social critique here. The idea that this figure is suffering, and not necessarily suffering because society is unfeeling or something like this, but that this figure is suffering perhaps because this is the nature of existence, and this is a Buddhist idea, right? But this idea that suffering is fundamental to existence, or suffering somehow underwrites the reality of the world, is a very central idea. So I think Bana's work is very, very interesting because it's so imagistic, and it's so much, here's a short but incredibly vivid description of a particular scene. And even when that scene has action, it's not driven necessarily by that action. It's not plot driven where we're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. The action is part of the sort of impressionistic approach that we get.